Okay, let's put all of these pieces together into a complete working example that we can invoke from a regular web browser. So the pieces that we need, first we need some sort of resource on the server. In the previous interactive example, we made a little simple text file called server result.txt, and it just contained a simple string. That's fine, and it works perfectly well, and you can do this in your examples. However, I'm going to use JSP in this example, just because JSP lets you run some code on the server that returns a different result each time, so that we can verify if we press a button 3 times, it calls the server 3 times. Don't worry about the syntax of JSP. You can just copy my file or stick with a plain text file like we did before. All right, then of course we need to load jQuery itself because $.ajax is defined by jQuery, not raw JavaScript. Then we need our own JavaScript file. And our own JavaScript file needs 2 functions. First, a function that's attached to the button, and that function we'll call $.ajax, just like we did interactively. But $.ajax uses the success option, and the success option is a function. So we have to define a second function, the function that will be invoked when the AJAX request comes back successfully. And then we need an HTML file to kind of hook everything together. The HTML file will load jQuery first, then it will load our JavaScript file, and it will have some sort of push button that the user can press. And we'll connect our first function up here to the push button. And so when the user presses the push button, it calls our main function. Our main function calls $.ajax. And then when the result comes back from the server, that main function will invoke the second function that we defined. Okay, so we did most of this interactively, but we're kind of connecting it all together in a regular HTML file. All right, so first we need a resource on the server. So here is the complete JSP file. Don't worry about completely understanding the syntax. You don't need to be able to modify this. But the key point here is that that little construct looks up the current date on the server. But in Java, this is Java, not JavaScript. This is running on the server, not on the browser. In Java, the date includes not just the month and the day, but also the hour, the minutes, and the seconds. And so it's just going to return back to the browser a little string saying it is now, and it'll list today's date and today's time. The reason I do this is just so that if I press a button 3 times, I can verify that what I'm getting back from the server is different each of those 3 times, and I'll address this shortly. But you don't need to know Java to understand this lecture. You don't need to be able to modify these JSP files. And I also want to point out that JSP is not the way that you build dynamic web applications in Java. It's a somewhat low-level technology, but it's perfectly good for supplying little tiny chunks of dynamic content for your AJAX requests. All right, so this little file with that one line, the complete contents of that file is that one little line, will sit on the server, and we can use that instead of server result.txt as the URL property of our AJAX requests. But again, you don't have to be able to do this yourself. And if you don't really care about seeing a different result when you press the button 3 times, just use a simple text file as we did in the interactive example. Okay, so that's the server resource, a one-liner. And now we need to write some JavaScript code. And in particular, we need 2 functions. We need the top-level function that we're going to hook to the button. The top-level function we'll call $.ajax. And it will use the URL option and point, in this case, at the JSP page that we just showed on the previous slide. And then for the success option, it will specify another function. Well, that other function doesn't exist yet. We need to write it. So we write that second function. And that second function takes the text of the server resource, and in this case, pops it up in a dialog box, an alert box. All right, so we have a server resource, which can just be some static text, or it can be some dynamic content. In this case, I'm using Java, so it's JSP. We have a JavaScript file with 2 functions, the main function that will hook to the push button and the AJAX success handler. And then finally an HTML file. The HTML file will first load jQuery itself. Then it will load the JavaScript file that we showed on the previous page that defined those two functions. And the first of the functions on the previous page was called showTime1. So finally, we make a push button. And we say when the user clicks on that push button, it calls showTime1. It starts that whole ajax process that previously we did interactively. Okay, let's try this whole process out in a browser. So this file here, jQuery ajax1.html, is the HTML file that puts everything together, the HTML file that was shown on the previous slide. So we add our application to Tomcat. We start the server. We bring up a web browser. We go to localhost / the name of the project, which in this case was jQuery Ajax. We run the HTML file that we just showed on the previous slide and in the editor. And it has a push button. The button at the top was the one that we've shown. The two buttons at the bottom we'll get to in the next few slides. And when we press the push button, it goes to the server. It invokes that little JSP page that spits out the time on the server, sends that little line of text back to the browser, and it gets passed to our success handler, which pops up in this little dialog box that you see. Okay, so don't be too intimidated. It's not that hard. You just need to make a server resource, which can be plain text or it could be JSP. You can just copy my JSP. And you make a function that calls $@Ajax and a second function that takes some text as an argument and does something with it. So I said before that the reason I use JSP instead of plain text is so that I could verify if I press the button more than one time that it actually called the server more than one time. So we can verify this. I press the button and it says the time, and here's the number of seconds. And I press it again and it shows the number of seconds and it has changed. And so I press the button twice, it calls my function twice, it calls Ajax twice, of course it calls the server twice, right? Well, it's not quite so obvious that it really does call the server twice, because browsers are allowed to cache, save locally on the end user's computer certain URLs so that if you access them again and they haven't changed, they don't have to make the network connection again. And some browsers are more aggressive about doing this than others. In particular, Internet Explorer is particularly aggressive about caching. Now, often, this is a good thing. If your Ajax request is calling to the server twice, and it's invoking the same address with the same arguments twice, you might as well save it. But in this case, if I press a button again later, I want to make sure that it's a new response. Most real-life applications, the data on the server doesn't change unless the arguments that you pass to the server changes. Well, we haven't passed any data to the server, so it should return the same result every time. This one doesn't because I'm looking up the time. So in this particular case, it's not that common in real life, but in this particular case, we're passing the same data to the server each time, nothing in this case, but we're getting a different result back each time, and we want to make sure that the browser doesn't cache the result. Now, Firefox doesn't cache the result anyway. Everything's fine already. But some browsers could cache the result. We don't usually worry about that because usually we pass data to the server. But if you have a situation like this, you can instruct that the browser not cache. Let me show you how. So to tell the browser not to cache, not to save locally the result of that address, you can use the cache option. Now again, I'm just showing you an advanced feature. This is not done that frequently in real life. In real life, most of the time, you pass some information to the server and you get some results back that depend on what you passed in. And if what you pass in uniquely identifies what comes back, then caching is actually a good thing. You don't want to disable caching. If you pass the same data later, you want to get the same result back. And if the browser happens to have cached it locally, all the better. It'll just be faster. We'll also see later that sometimes you send post requests, and post requests are not cached. However, in this particular case, we didn't pass any information to the server, but the result that comes back each time shows the current time on the server, and so it changes each time, and we would like to make sure that the browser doesn't cache. The browser we were using didn't cache anyway, but some browsers do. They're allowed to cache, so we can prevent caching with cache equals false. You won't make use of that in most of your applications, but I just wanted to mention it because of this particular example where the server result is different each time. So let's revisit our previous example. In the example that we just showed, we set an on-click handler that said when the end user clicks on this push button, run this JavaScript code, call show time. Notice the parentheses, run this code. Now, this is very natural, and this is the easiest way to understand. You attach an explicit attribute that says on click, when the user clicks this, run this JavaScript code. And that seems very natural. However, in jQuery, they advocate an approach called unobtrusive JavaScript. In particular, the kind of philosophy of most jQuery developers and the jQuery originators, designers, is that you should have a complete separation. Your HTML should just contain HTML. Your JavaScript should just contain JavaScript. And in particular, you shouldn't put JavaScript explicitly in your HTML. Well, if I can't put JavaScript explicitly in HTML, then how can I have my push button run JavaScript? And that's what we want to look at now with this unobtrusive JavaScript strategy.